Good morning once again, colleagues. As Richard has already highlighted, my name is Masuka, and I'm the Executive Director for Amnesty International Zimbabwe. I will share with you the state of human rights in Zimbabwe for the year 2023. What Mongai has highlighted in respect of the region is also what we picked up here in Zimbabwe. I'll start off by sharing with you our findings as they relate to repression of dissent. We picked up that the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly continued to be threatened, especially during the general election period. Members of the main opposition party, the Citizens Coalition for Change, were the main targets of repression. And this repression took various forms, from the enactment of repressive pieces of legislation. In July 2022, just a month before the election day, the president signed into law the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Amendment Act 2022, which is also known in other circles as the Patriotic Act. This act failed to meet the requirements of legality, proportionality, and necessity in relation to the imposition by the authorities of penalties like loss of citizenship for citizens by registration or those who hold dual citizenship, the death penalty, as well as the revocation of the right to vote or the right to hold public office. The piece of legislation also heightened the risk of arbitrary detention against those who expressed dissenting views and contained overly broad provisions that criminalized participation in meetings. Apart from repressive pieces of legislation, we also noted that the right to protest was restricted. We noted that there were arrests of individuals or groups who protested. In this regard, we have the arrest of the 6 University of Zimbabwe students as an example. These students were protesting against the prolonged incarceration of political activists such as Job Sikala and Jacob Ganvume. They were arrested, detained, denied bail for a number of weeks, then subsequently released on bail. But as we speak, you may recall that this year, the charges that were being leveled against the students were ultimately withdrawn. But they had spent time in pre-trial detention in 2023. We also picked up a number of cases of abductions and torture, particularly after the 23 August elections. We recorded cases of abductions relating to City Council member Obera Ishenende, who is with Triple C, together with his friend Sonia Lemukham. We also recorded cases relating to James Chidapa, a former MP of Mavuku, who was abducted and tortured, the case of Takudzwa Ngadziwore, as well as the case of Tafumane Masaya, who was killed in the process. I'll move on to highlight what we noted in respect of issues to do with arbitrary detention and unfair trials. We observed that there were cases, particularly during the election period, relating to arbitrary detention, and one such case relates to the arrest of the 40 staff members of the Election Resource Center and the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, who were held in Communicado at Harare Central Police Station, denied access to their lawyers and to their family members in contravention of provisions under the Constitution and international standards of fairness. They were subsequently charged, released on bail, and they were charged with attempting to announce the election results ahead of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission's official announcement. We also observed that there were a number of cases that went through trial, which cases had risen during periods ranging from 2020 to 2021, where there were convictions that were not supported by the law. One such case is the case of former spokesperson of the CCC, Fadzai Mahere, who was charged with publishing falsehoods, despite the fact that it was highlighted in court and there was a High Court judgment that specifically stated that the charge that was being preferred against her, or that offense, was no longer in existence. She was convicted and sentenced to paying a fine of $500. But you may be aware that this year, that conviction was subsequently overturned by the High Court. But you also recall that even when she was arrested, she was actually detained for a number of days back then in 2020. The other case that we picked up related to the conviction and sentencing of Jacob Ngarifume, who is the leader of the opposition party Transform Zimbabwe. He was convicted and sentenced to 48 months imprisonment, arising from a charge that was preferred against him in July 2020, where he was being accused for leading and organizing anti-corruption protests. And he was charged with inciting public violence, convicted, sentenced to 48 months in prison, which 12 were suspended. He then served 8 months, and in November, the conviction again was overturned by the High Court on the basis that there was no evidence supporting that conviction, but he had already served 8 months in prison. Then we picked up the case of Job Sikala, a former CCC MP for Zengeza West constituency, who was convicted by the Magistrate Court on 3 May on obstruction of justice charges. Almost a year after his arrest in June 2022, he was ordered to pay a fine of $600. But again, on 28 November, the High Court overturned the conviction and the sentence, and he was acquitted, though he remained in custody as he had other charges preferred against him. So we can see this pattern where the Magistrate Court convicted political activists, despite the fact that their lawyers would have highlighted the gaps or the weaknesses in those cases, but they were convicted after either going through pretrial detention, and a few months down the line, those convictions would then be overturned by the High Court. So in this case, we see a pattern of the use of the justice system to persecute political activists. We further recorded a case that related to legal practitioners being arrested. In this particular case, we noted the case of Doug Poltert and Tapiwa Mchineripi, who are both members of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, who were arrested for advising the police that their clients, Umbera Ishenente and Sonele Mkuhlane, were in poor health and under medical review following their abduction and torture by alleged state security agents. The lawyers were charged with obstruction of justice. They were initially detained, then released on bail, but again this year the charges were withdrawn. I will also just highlight cases that we picked up that relate to unlawful attacks and killings, and in this particular case we noted the case of Tinashe Chitsunge, a CCC activist who was reportedly stoned to death by ZANU-PF members in Glenview South, Harare, on 3 August. He was believed to have been attacked while trying to flee from a ZANU-PF mob who were attacking opposition activists at a rally. So in terms of civil and political rights, these are the observations that we made with regards to the human rights situation in Zimbabwe in 2023. I'll move on to just highlight the observations that we made in respect of issues to do with the right to health. The country grappled with a cholera outbreak stemming primarily from a severe lack of clean water. As of late September, almost 7,000 suspected new cases were recorded, and by 9 October, the death toll had reached 100. Zimbabwe first recurring cholera outbreaks exacerbated by poverty and inadequate infrastructure. As the number of cholera cases increased, sewage management problems and ineffective refuse collection posed additional challenges, raising fears that the crisis would worsen with the approaching rainy season. We noted under women and girls' rights the following issues. Firstly, that the government failed to take measures to prevent and fully respond to the treatment needs of those suffering from obstetric fistula. This was an area of interest to us as Amnesty International, having conducted research which brought out the dire situation that women with obstetric fistula, women and girls with obstetric fistula find themselves in. So we were very interested in this particular issue. What we noted is that the government did not develop an adequate policy framework or ensure adequate funding for maternal health, despite calls from civil society organizations to do so, and despite the issue being raised in Parliament as a matter of national importance. Gaps in the legal framework relating to access to sexual and reproductive health services for adolescents persisted. Parliament continued to fail to make the necessary amendments to the Public Health Act to allow health workers to provide sexual and reproductive health services to children without their parents' consent. In addition, the cost of essential health care services proved prohibitive for many women and girls, and there was a failure to provide comprehensive sex education in schools. We also noted the issue of underrepresentation of women in decision-making positions. Only 6 of the 26 cabinet members appointed in September were women. 70 female parliamentary candidates contested in the August 2023 elections, compared with 637 men across the 210 constituencies. Of the 7, only 22 were directly elected. We, however, also took note of some positive developments as they relate to human rights in the country in 2023, and this one of such a development is the enactment or the amendment to the Children's Amendment Act number 8 of 2023. Positive provisions in this piece of legislation include the removal of all clauses that refer to anyone under the age of 18 as a young person, defining them instead as children in line with the Constitution. So this is the state of the human rights situation. We do not compare the extent of human rights violations across countries or across the region, neither do we rank. What we just do is to highlight the situation of human rights violations. So if you go through that report, you can then do your own analysis. But I think you will see that when Mongai was presenting on the regional report, most of the issues that are emerging within the region, we also see them emerging within Zimbabwe. That's how I would respond to your question. And I will take the question